like to invite everyone to stand, please. This feast of Dr. Martin Luther King, remember Dr. King and all the women and men throughout the world who gave their life in service, who gave their life in the struggle for justice. I'd like us all to bow our heads in our own ways to pray silently that God's peace might descend upon our troubled world. Almighty God, we thank you for this day when we remember Dr. Martin Luther King, when we remember the struggle, when we remember those people, known and unknown, who give and who gave their lives to teach us ways of peace, ways of truth. And we thank you in a special way for bringing to our community Dr. Cornel West. We thank you for the work that he has done to promote awareness and understanding. We pray in a very special way for all those people in our world who work, who struggle, who educate, who teach us to understand that we are all sisters and brothers. Lord Jesus Christ, we praise you. Have mercy on our world and pour the spirit of peace into the hearts of all. And help us here to be peacemakers who work for harmony and love. Grant this gift to all of us. Amen. Amen. Please be seated.
On behalf of St. Michael's College, I want to welcome all of you. Some of you are members of our college community. Some have been members in the past. Some perhaps will be members in the future. But whether you have or will be a member, thanks for coming and thanks for being with us today. Why a commemoration of Martin Luther King at St. Michael's College? Those of you who have noticed the climate outside realize this is not Selma. This is a very white area, not only with the snow, a state that has perhaps the smallest proportion of Afro-Americans than any state in the country, and at a college which has only a few Afro-Americans. Why then a commemoration of Martin Luther King here in what is perhaps the snowiest or most northern celebration of his birthday? One reason might be that it is, and I'm quoting, the mission of St. Michael's College to contribute through higher education to the development of human culture. And borrowing a phrase, in fact, the title of a book of our speaker today, certainly race matters for human culture. And indeed, the values of Martin Luther King matter a great deal for human culture. We're pleased that At St. Michael's, we have a Martin Luther King Society which sponsors this celebration today. And I want to thank those who organized it, thank Father Cronague, thank Dot Williams, and especially thank the officers and members of the Martin Luther King Society. It is good, I'm convinced, that we are here today in this place of God to commemorate Martin Luther King. Thank you for being with us.
This afternoon, the African American Symposium Committee and the Martin Luther King Jr. Society are proud to present its second event of its lecture series. This series, under the chairmanship of Father Mike Cronague, is an attempt to increase multicultural awareness here at St. Michael's College and the surrounding communities. The inaugural event last year featured Native American cultures. This year, the focus is on African Americans, and in subsequent years, other cultures will be celebrated. We're delighted that you could join us, and we hope that you will find our presentation rewarding.
Surely the presence of the Lord is in this place. It warms my heart to see so many of you here on such an inclement day. And I was thinking as I looked around the church that Dr. King can still draw a crowd. We have assembled here today to commemorate the life and deeds of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. On Saturday, which was Dr. King's birthday, Klansmen in Atlanta demonstrated to protest this holiday in his honor. But here at St. Michael's College, we proudly celebrate this holiday because Dr. King was truly a man committed to peace and justice for all members in the global community. Similar celebrations are being presented around our nation today in churches, schools, colleges, and universities. But our program is distinctly unique because of the individual who will deliver the keynote address, Dr. Cornel West. Indeed, this is an auspicious occasion for St. Michael's College, and yes, we are understandably euphoric that Dr. West is here to share his wisdom with us. There are scarcely few within the Academy who have not heard of Dr. West, this author. His books include the bestseller Race Matters, Breaking Bread, his collaborative work with Bell Hooks, and his current book, Keeping Faith, Philosophy of Race in America. This scholar, he is a professor of religion and director of the Afro-American Studies Department at Princeton, soon to be at Harvard in the fall. This activist, he explicitly articulates the issue of race. This philosopher, last June, Time magazine called him a philosopher with a mission, and the Chronicle of Higher Education ascribed the epithet celebrity philosopher. This intellectual, in a Newsweek profile, Ellis Coase wrote that he is the hot black intellectual of this moment. Dr. West earned his bachelor's degree from Harvard, graduating magna cum laude, and his master's and doctoral degrees from Princeton. Because Dr. West is in such demand as a dynamic orator, I again affirm how honored we are to have him address us this afternoon. Please join me in expressing our warmest St. Michael's and Vermont welcome to this distinguished scholar and lecturer, Dr. Cornel West. Dr. West.
What a wonderful, wonderful introduction. I want to thank my good friend and colleague, Dr. Dorothy Williams. Can you hear me in the back? Way up at the top. I was thanking my good friend and colleague, Dr. Dorothy A. Williams, who's doing such a marvelous job here in Vermont and at St. Michael's College. I am not just, yes, indeed. Very much so. It's not just a delight and a pleasure to be here. It is an honor and a blessing. I'd like to thank President Paul Rice for being kind enough of inviting me here. Similarly so, Brother Friar Michael Cronague, who I know also played a very important role in tracking me down, as it were, and allowing me to come up to Vermont and see this beautiful snow and see these beautiful faces that I see at this very moment. I'd also like to thank Sister Makita Gilliam, leader, president, visionary of Martin Luther King Society here at St. Michael's College. Last but not least, I want to thank Richard Johnson and the MLK Singers. And I say that in all seriousness because it is impossible to fully comprehend the depths of Martin Luther King Jr. and the tradition that produced him without understanding the fundamental role of music and the fundamental role of spirituality. Because King was produced by a tradition that at times enabled him when he was down on his knees just to sing a song. Pushed against the wall, his back pushed against the wall. He could just crack a smile. And my God, how much we need a prophetic spirituality in our day that fuses a substantive talk about love with a tough talk about justice. That's what I've come to do this afternoon, is to talk about Brother Martin and the tradition that produced him. Because Martin is not an isolated icon or a superhuman hero to put on a pedestal, but he flows out of a long and rich and grand tradition of struggle. A struggle for freedom and a struggle for dignity. It's a tradition of many thousands gone. Many of those, as Brother Michael said, who gave their time, they gave their energy, and some gave their lives to ensure that ordinary people could live lives of decency and dignity. Tradition not just of black freedom struggle, but in fact it is the best of the democratic tradition. And T.S. Eliot, in his famous essay of 1919, Tradition and Individual Talent, is absolutely right when he says tradition is not something you inherit. If you want it, you must obtain it with great labor. The fundamental question for us is to what degree this tradition is still alive in our time. A tradition represented by a Sojourner Truth or a Harriet Tubman or an Ida B. Wells Barnett, or an A. Philip Randolph, an Ella Baker, or Fannie Lou Hamer, just to mention these names, dwarfs one in terms of their contribution to this tradition I'm talking about. But it's just not black folk. And this is something we must fully recognize. But it includes white sisters like Lydia Maria Child, who published in 1833 that powerful text, Appeal in Favor of that Class of Americans called Africans. Or Elijah Lovejoy, who gave his life shot standing on the roof of his house in 1837 in Alton, Illinois. It's part of the struggle for freedom, expanding the scope of democracy. Miles Horton's Highlander Center, you all recall Highlander Center. Rosa Parks came out of that center. Stokely Carmichael came out of it. Bob Moses and Diane Nash and a whole host of freedom fighters of all colors. Don West, another white brother, just died last year. James Peck, we could go on and on. Asian sisters like Grace Boggs, who at this very moment is still keeping this tradition alive in Detroit. or Cesar Chavez. We just lost him. What a rich and grand tradition of struggle. It is a tradition that claims not just that ordinary people ought to live lives of decency and dignity, but also that ordinary people's voices ought to be heard at the highest levels of decision-making processes in those institutions that guide and regulate their lives. It makes Pascalian leaps of faith in the mental and moral capacities of ordinary people to manage themselves and govern themselves. There's a brother who used to play the organ in my church, Shiloh Baptist Church in Sacramento, California. We knew him as Sylvester, but he's known to the world for the genius that he is. His name is Sly Stone. He wrote a song called Everyday People. Of course, Arrested Development picked it up, called it People Every Day. Speak a little faster these days in the postmodern condition here. But the point is the same. Too much changeable and transformable social misery among ordinary people, among everyday people. And it might have something to do with the fact that their voices are not being heard at the highest levels. And that Martin Luther King Jr. came out of a particular species, a specific version of the democratic tradition. Because there was a form of authority that was standing in the way of a particular slice of ordinary people. It was called white supremacy. And white supremacy claimed that, lo and behold, black beauty and black intelligence and black capacity and black capability and black humanity was less than that of other people. Told people of African descent, you've got the wrong hips and the wrong lips and the wrong hair texture. Told people of African descent that you can't reason coherently, you can't project a speech articulately. You're less than, and didn't just tell them that, they institutionalized it. Yes, even many churches of God propagated that kind of ideology. The highest authorities in science propagated that kind of ideology. Mass culture did. And meant that then one slice of God's children were bombarded every day, perennially, incessantly with these claims. You're less than. You're less than. And yet, when the first proud and skilled African got off of that slave ship and decided that I want to be free. And then if I can't be free, at least I want to be myself. The tradition of struggle against white supremacy as one version of the democratic tradition began. And white supremacy is only one particular form of authority needed to be criticized. We could talk about male supremacy. We could talk about oligarchic authority. We could talk about homophobic authority. All of the various forms in which elites put forward claims in which there's no mechanisms of accountability or no means by which arbitrary uses of power can be curtailed. It is a grand tradition. It's the best of America. Because America begins as an experiment in democracy. And yet that experiment in democracy would subordinate 21% of its inhabitants in inheritable and chattel slavery, in which people of African descent had no legal status, no social standing, no public worth, were only of economic value. Attempts to systematically strip them of access to any means by which they could hold on to their predecessors of progeny. Orlando Patterson of Harvard University calls it natal alienation. Alienated at birth. Dishonored, degraded, devalued, subject to the brutish contingency of the slave auction in which One, any moment, may be separated from one's loved ones. You all know the story. I don't invoke the story to solicit pity. No, not at all. But simply to ensure that we can understand that the tradition that I'm talking about was up against overwhelming and excruciating conditions and circumstances, but it had a will to persist, a will to persevere, and a will to prevail. 244 years of inheritable slavery. And for the first 87 years of the history of this democratic republic. And of course, we got to read that adjective democratic in a dialectical way, don't we? It's very much what David Walker, in his great appeal to the colored citizens of the world, did in his dialectical reading of Thomas Jefferson, saying Thomas Jefferson, this grand democratic theorist on the one hand, Thomas Jefferson, this slaveholder on the other. I need to out-Jeffersonize Jefferson, he said. The very evils of democracy, more democracy, which means you build on the best of Jefferson and you bring critique to bear on his blindnesses, on his silences, on his exclusions in his own democratic vision. It's history that I'm talking about, over against which the tradition that produced Martin Luther King Jr. was struggling. Also is inseparable from those 75 years after slavery of institutionalized terrorism. Jim Crow, Jane Crow, every 2.5 days for 48 years, some black child, a black woman, a black man was hanging from some tree, that strange fruit that southern trees bear, about which Billie Holiday sang. And no major movement against it in the nation. Subject to that kind of horror in the midst of the city on the hill that is supposed to provide an example of the very fragile democracy, because every democracy is fragile. That's why a fundamental commitment to democracy requires such investment among citizens. Each and every one of you know that when we look at the history of the human adventure, for the most part, it is ordinary people who are forced to defer to kings and queens and prelates and potentates and princes and suzerains. How rare it is that a notion of citizenship, ordinary people capable of ruling or being ruled, giving judgment, holding office, hence putting a premium on the rotation of rulers and the alternation of rule. How rare it is that those kinds of experiments are able to survive. And one of the great insights, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., was he knew that to talk about race in America was to take us to the very heart of the crisis of the fragile but precious experiment called America. Because he knew that every democracy known to humankind has been undermined usually by escalating levels of poverty that produce despair, and escalating levels of paranoia that produce distrust. So to talk about race, to talk about people of African descent, is not to talk about just one slice of America, or just to talk about brothers and sisters in chocolate cities. It's to raise the question, can this experiment called America survive? Which means that our destinies are interlinked, which means that we're all in it together, which means that we're all on the same boat. It's got a leak in it, whether you drive a Mercedes or whether you're walking, whether you are upper class, upper middle class, stable working, lower working, not working, whatever, we hang together or we hang separately. This is what Martin understood. And that's why to talk about race and to reflect on the challenge of Martin Luther King Jr. is incumbent upon every person who is serious about the experiment called America and concerned about whether this particular experiment in democracy can survive. If you agree as I do that democracy is, in fact, as a mode of governance, as a means by which we arrange our social relations, it's the best that we've featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creatures born between urine and feces, made in the image of God, have come up with, then you realize there's much at stake. Much at stake indeed. I live every 2.5 months in Ethiopia, as some of you may know. We're trying to get off the ground a democratic project so that ordinary Ethiopians can have a voice and maybe minimize some of the levels of social misery there. But when I return to America every year, what do I see? I see relative economic decline and undeniable cultural decay, and I see a sense of political helplessness and impotence, which is to say that I feel as if, I could be wrong, this is one of the most frightening and terrifying moments in the history of this country. Because economic decline, with its social slippage and downward mobilities of millions and millions of America, usually brings out the worst in each and every one of us. It leaves us open to scapegoating, trying to blame others for why, in fact, we're sliding down the social ladder. It lends itself to conspiratorial theories that are symptomatic of the escalating paranoia and distrust. An economic decline that has gone hand in hand with the distribution of wealth upward. An economic decline in which, no doubt, people feel as if they're caught in circumstances far, far beyond their control. I'm keeping my eye on the majority of Americans. I know about the tremendous increase of wealth of the 1% in this nation who own 48% of the total financial wealth. Sounds oligarchic and plutocratic to me. Or the top 20% who have experienced tremendous increase in income. But I'm talking about those who have experienced wage deflation, 44%. An economic decline has gone hand in hand with a focus on the disadvantaged. President Clinton the other day, in a speech in Memphis, alluded to what Martin Luther King Jr. would say if he returned, when he set his eyes on black communities and saw the level of violence and crime, not just the violence and crime, but the distrust and paranoia within black America. Much of it self-hatred and self-loathing. But what President Clinton didn't say is that Martin Luther King Jr. would not stop there. He would look at the economy, and he would see the devastating consequences of what sociologists call deindustrialization, industrial flight. And he would say, yes, when I was here, 40% of young black men had decent paying industrial jobs, and in 1994, it is 7%. Downward mobility. He would say, how did it come to be that in the last 14 years, the salaries of corporate executives have increased 225% at a time in which plants are closing and workers are laid off and benefits are slashed? What's going on? He would say, I refuse to demonize any group of fellow citizens. But I'm going to tell the truth. And if it's greed, it's greed. There's no mechanisms of accountability in terms of access to the revenues, then most human beings are going to keep it. Which means somebody is hemorrhaging the democratic processes such that 20% of American children can live in poverty. And 51% of black children can live in poverty. And 42% of Spanish-speaking young brothers and sisters can live in poverty, and yet we still have redistribution of wealth going upward? What is happening? Blockage seems to be at work here, because most poor people wouldn't choose to be poor. I have a deep respect for monks who actually make vows of poverty. But I don't believe it's going to become a mass movement among ordinary people. Not at all. But it's not just the relative economic decline. Most of us know that in our own everyday experience, it is the cultural decay that one focuses on. And by cultural decay, what I mean is the ways in which a market culture produces market moralities and market mentalities such that it tries to convince us that we ought to be addicted to stimulation and titillation in order to consume to keep the wheels of the economy rolling. And it is a cultural decay that results in a hedonism, a narcissism, a privatism that pushes to the edges non-market values. In King's life at its best, he was not perfect. All prophets are imperfect. But his life at its best, and the tradition that produced him at its best, has been about non-market values like love and care and concern and service to others and solidarity and justice and community and loyalty and commitment. Yet, in a market culture, it looks as if more and more people decide that one wants to gain access to pleasure and power and property, and for some citizens, by any means. What a spiritually impoverished mode of being in the world. One might as well hook up to a pleasure machine forever. No friendship, no conversation, no play, just hook up. And of course, so much of the market culture revolves around sexual foreplay and orgiastic intensities anyway. But we're not surprised when those institutions that have tried to transmit non-market values begin to lose their strength and their power. We talk about the disintegration of the family. The crisis of the family is but one version of it, because even when the nuclear family was in place, most of you know that you don't raise a child just among the two of you. You need a closely knit neighborhood. You need a closely knit family. You need Little League coaches and dance teachers. You need responsible teachers in school. You've heard over and over again the African proverb that it takes a whole village to raise a child. It takes a whole community to raise a child. The marginalization of non-market values results in the erosion of the nurturing system for children. And family is one example. And as you can imagine, the vacuum is filled by the dominant forces in our society, the market forces. And what is distinctive about young people is that they are more creatures of the market than any other generation in the history of this country, which makes it much more difficult for them to gain access to non-market values. It creates social deracination and cultural denudement. What I mean by social deracination is a sense of feeling rootless, just drifting. And it's not just a matter of intergenerational relationships. There was a poll the other day that said that 42% of young black kids in Chocolate City said they didn't have a best friend. I cannot imagine growing up without a best friend, my brother, let alone mom and dad. That is a level of rootlessness and drift that cannot but result in meaninglessness and hopelessness, helplessness, more and more lovelessness, even touchlessness. We see it in our personal relationships, market conceptions of relationships in which non-market values like tenderness, kindness, and gentleness push to the edges. I'm talking about a creeping zeitgeist of cold-heartedness and mean-spiritedness in our culture, where the salient feature more and more becomes fear of violent attack or vicious insult or indecent exposure. Cultural decay, reinforcing the balkanization and fragmentation on racial lines, given the legacy of white supremacy in the society. A recent report says that American housing patterns are more segregated now than they were in the 1960s. That's why people talk about chocolate cities and vanilla suburbs. The inability to actually overcome the chasm, the thick walls of demarcation between black and brown, red and yellow, and white brothers and sisters. What would Martin say about our present moment? You say, are there possibilities for political agency? Well, Brother Martin, we also live in a moment in which vast numbers of fellow citizens have lost trust in public institutions. They no longer have confidence in the ability of public institutions to do anything right. How then can the democratic tradition stay alive? John Dewey said it so well in his classic of 1927, The Public and Its Problems, where he said, one distinctive feature of a democracy in profound crisis is a public life that is barren, vacuous, and empty. A public life which is shunned by the vast numbers of fellow citizens. A public life that is associated with squalor. Ask most Americans about public education. They run from it. I know they might not run up here in Vermont. I don't know. But where I'm from, When we talk about public education that's associated with young black and brown bodies and persons run the opposite way. Talk about public transportation, run from it. Public infrastructure, roads, railways, bridges, more and more collapsing, a sign of the degree to which we have devalued the very links and bonds that hold us together as a people, as a nation, as a country. And most important for educational institutions is the loss of public conversation. The ability to inhabit public space and to exchange visions and arguments mediated by mutual respect and civility. So much of what goes for public conversation these days is name-calling and finger-pointing and clashes of identities and clients and constituencies with hardly any sense at all of public-mindedness. The great Martin Buber used to say that when you enter a dialogue, you ought to be different than you were when you leave a dialogue, you ought to be different than when you enter. You don't just come in and lay down your agenda. You don't just come in and sock it to them, or you don't just come in and appease them to make them feel good. You don't just come in to try to pacify any kind of serious engagement. Public dialogue is about change and transformation on a variety of different levels. And when one loses the art of public conversation, communication breaks down. You don't know how to convey and exchange your views. So all you can do is trot out your prejudices. What a dark and difficult moment. Martin Luther King Jr. represents an attempt to keep the best of a radical democratic tradition alive by ensuring that persons constitute a vibrant public life that focuses on the most disadvantaged citizens in the republic. And he knew that that public life could not be reconstituted and regenerated, rejuvenated, unless one, fellow citizens had a sense of history, and he knew how un-American that is. Henry Ford said, history is bunk, and he spoke for many Americans. So many Americans, it's an escape from history, a distancing from tradition. Like Henry Ford's automobile, we want to be mobile and individualistic, always on the road. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, everything good is on the highway. How American. The cosmos is on wheels, he says. How American. Like Huck on the boat, always moving, not landing for too long. Or like Ahab on the ship, keeping his distance from society, history, the sense of the tragic conflict taking place among human beings who must interact with one another. Trying to escape. Henry James said that American civilization was a hotel civilization. That's one reason why he escaped to Europe. And the hotel is a fusion of a home and a market. Americans love, we love the warmth and security and surety of the home. Usually put the mother on a pedestal. Motherhood, like a bedrock. We also love the market, mobility, liquidity. And there's some virtues there and some vices. But what is distinctive about home and market is that they're both a privatistic phenomenon. What about the public interest? What about common good? King was about public interest and common good, the balancing of the private and the public. And the sense of history provides a means by which we recognize when the imbalance sets in, who pays the major cost. Privatization is now on the lips. So many fellow citizens, corporate elites, banking elites, political elites, got a problem, privatize. Got a problem, privatize. The private has its place, but who will pay the social cost? Who will bear the social burden? Usually disproportionately black and brown, but by no means exclusively black and brown. It's ordinary people tend to pay the cost. King's focus, not just as a Democrat, but as a Christian, looking at the world through the eyes of the cross, was on those everyday people. If we have a sense of history, we're able to see the ambiguous legacies of the past. We recognize that no culture, no civilization, no society has a monopoly on virtue or wisdom. We know that various cultures themselves are hybrid cultures, shot through the variety of different mixtures of cultures, and to be an American is to be a product of a hybrid culture. A sense of subtlety necessary. In fact, King would go as far as to say, as he notes, a sense of the tragic. Again, how un-American, but yet how necessary for our moment. And by tragic, what I mean is an expiration of the possibilities for human action at any particular moment. Don't confuse the tragic with the pathetic. Pathetic's about victims. The tragic is about agents fighting against the odds, against the limits he knows not of, limits she knows not of. A sense of history is crucial for citizens to reach the conclusion that they ought to reconstitute public life. That the democracy is worth fighting for and expanding. And it is no accident that when struggles of ordinary people escalate, a sense of history escalates. The 1890s and the 1930s and the 1960s were moments in which the highest levels of a sense of history were at work precisely because ordinary people were coming together to bring critique to bear on prevailing status quo. There is indeed a hunger and a thirst among young people to get in contact with their history, but how difficult it is in a market culture. Market culture likes to bring it back with the docudrama, in which instead of getting a tragic sense of history, you get a melodramatic version of history. You can't wait until the end because you know it's going to be syrupy and virtue triumphing. No, King was murdered at 39. He was shot dead by a sick white brother, most of us believe. It doesn't end happily like some cheap soap opera. History is not like that. It is psychic scars and existential bruises and ontological wounds and silent tears, along with the joys and the small victories. This is what a training ground for democratic citizenship ought to be about, because democracies in general have to come to terms with a tragic sense of history if we're going to keep them alive. And one would hope the tragic sense of history would go hand in hand with an all-embracing moral vision, because if one keeps track of the circumstances against which people must struggle, then one is more likely to empathize and sympathize with them. Simone Weil, one of the great Jewish philosophers of the 20th century, once said that love of thy neighbor in all of its fullness means being able to say to him or her, what are you going through? Can I be of service? That I want to identify with your frustrations and your anxieties. I want to walk a mile in your shoes. I want to know what it's like to be you before I criticize you, because I have a sense of history. And I know that you, like me, will not be here that long, and together we can be stronger than in antagonistic relation. Expanding the scope of compassion based on a deep and abiding sense of history, which is linked to the third feature, which is a self-critical, courageous stance. If one goes about reconstituting public life, one must do it in a self-critical manner, not self-righteousness. No arrogance, no haughtiness. If you're going to point out hypocrisy, you have to be willing to point it out in yourself. But you also know that it takes courage to do that. Martin Luther King Jr. recognized, like Socrates, that the unexamined life is not worth living. But he also exemplified the fact that the examined life is painful. It's full of risk and vulnerability. You all recall that famous sentence in Malcolm X's autobiography where he says, "My life is a chronology of changes." And those changes have to do with self-criticism. King understood that as well. The only way you grow, the only way you mature and develop is through self-critique. And that self-criticism ought to produce some humility, and humility is a means by which you can forge bonds of trust among fellow citizens. Because if you're willing to acknowledge you might be wrong, you might in fact be wrong. And accept it. And not feel bad about it. Because it's the only means by which you can grow. And it also will give you some grounds to point out other persons being wrong in such a way that it is empowering to them rather than disempowering to them. A substantive democratic citizenry is crucial. And if it has no sense of history, if it has no all-embracing moral vision, if it has no self-critical, courageous stance, it generates the same kind of distrust and paranoia that created the very problem in the first place. Friedrich Nietzsche said it well when he said, at times it's not simply a matter of having the courage of one's convictions, but also having the courage to attack one's convictions. You could be wrong. Nothing is immune to revision. It was Charles Sanders Peirce, that great American philosopher who generated the major indigenous form of philosophical reflection in this nation, called American pragmatism. He said, never block the road to inquiry, to conversation. But if you want to partake, you must be willing to put your relative ignorance and naked power under the spotlight. What a democratic sensibility. The only deeper form I know is a jazz quartet, but I know we don't have time to talk about that now. Improvisational sensibility, in which accountability is in fact enacted in performance, so no one takes center stage. Everyone must be connected with the other, but never losing sight of one's own distinctive individuality in the collective performance. That's Duke Ellington. That's Louis Armstrong. That's the great John Coltrane, or Billie Holiday, or Sarah Vaughan. Democratic sensibility. What a marvelous model for conversation, for dialogue. Why? Because you're part of something bigger than you. And each is attempting to accent the best in each because they're not keeping their eyes on each other, but on something bigger than them. Is that not what Democracy at its best is about, is that not what Martin Luther King Jr. was projecting? Is that not what a whole host of freedom fighters of all colors across this nation and world have tried to do? Last but not least, if we are to reconstitute public life and deal seriously with the crisis of American democracy, we need more than ever what I call audacious hope. We are a world-weary people. We're tired. I travel around this nation, and good-hearted, well-intended people walk up to me and say, "Oh, Brother West, you're raising that issue of race again. We solved that issue in the 60s. Why are you bringing it back again?" I look on television, I see Oprah and Arsenio and Martin. You got all these black folk so highly visible. They're doing so very well. I say, yes, Oprah, Winfrey, Martin, they are doing very well. But I'm keeping my eye on the mass of the black folk who are not doing very well. It's precisely that metaphor that we must shatter, the metaphor of invisibility that Ralph Ellison talked about. It's a metaphor that puts black people within a framework in which we constitute one homogeneous blob, which means that every black person is interchangeable and substitutable. So you only need one voice because the one voice speaks for everybody. You only need one symbol because that one symbol holds for all black folk. In fact, I used to experience this sometimes in college, and I was the only black student in class. And anytime the issue of race emerged, people all look at me and say, "Yeah, what do black people think?" I said, "I don't know. I haven't engaged in empirical investigation of all of them, but I can tell you what this one thinks." What does Jesse want? If we can find out just what Jesse wants, we know what all the black folk want. No, what Jesse wants is what Jesse wants. Based on his vision, based on his analysis. There's diversity and multiplicity and heterogeneity and complexity in the black world. And so when we talk about race, it's not to make people guilty, it's not to disempower people, it's not for people to feel paralyzed. It's to take us to the very heart of the crisis of American democracy, because one believes, in fact, that there are things that are worth fighting for, and some of it resides in this land. That's what Martin was about, as I understand it. And he knew that there could be no candid and critical discussion about race, there could be no candid and critical discussion about the crisis of American democracy unless you could instill in persons by means of example an audacious hope. Energize them, galvanize them, convince them that what we think and what we do can make a difference. Convince them that the world is incomplete, that history is unfinished, that the future is open-ended. Convince them, in fact, that no matter how dark and difficult the moment, that it is, in fact, always dawn that day breaks forever. That at this very moment above the eastern horizon, the sun is somewhere about to peep. And given that crack, that window of opportunity, if we can seize it, we might be able to turn back those various forces that seem to be impeding the democratic project in this country and around the world. And so I say to you this afternoon, St. Michael's, that I pray God that you keep your head to the sky. As Mahalia used to say, keep your hands on the plow. And your eyes not on each other, but on the prize. And it does not take large numbers to make a difference. It only takes a prophetic minority in each respective community who takes integrity and character and sacrifice and service seriously. There's no guarantee of victory. But as T.S. Eliot said so well in the Four Quartets, ours is in the trying. The rest is not our business. There's powers greater than us at work through us. In the short lives that we have, we simply want to leave the world a little better than we found it. Thank God that Brother Martin left it a little bit better than he found it. What an example. Let's try to keep that tradition alive. Thank you all so very much.
On behalf of the St. Michael's African American Symposium Committee and Lecture Series and the entire college community, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today to celebrate the ideals of Dr. Martin Luther King. I'd like to especially thank Richard Johnson from the University of Vermont for his uplifting music. And of course, Dr. Cornel West for his insightful and inspirational talk.